This podcast contains spoilers, so listen at your own risk or call back after you've watched the movie.
You know who you call. Leave a message. Maybe they'll call you back. Then again, maybe they won't.
We're having ourselves quite a little game of phone tag here.
Ring, ring, ring. I usually get this guy's answering machine.
I'll call you right back.
If you're there, please pick up the phone. I really want to talk to you.
I check my fucking messages every day when I come home from work. My answering machine, zero. I got a blinking light.
All I have to do is pick up this phone right here, inform the cinema, and your plan's kaput.
No, I ain't got no phone. I had to pull, because people calling all the time, and who needs the aggravation, right? Interruptions.
So I watched The Shape of Things last night. The third film, from what I can make out, that's both written and directed by Neil LaBute. Or to be clear, some of the films prior to this were written by him, but they were co-written by him. Whereas this, like his first film, In the Company of Men, and his follow-up, Your Friends and Neighbors, is just him as the sole writer, him as the sole director, kind of as pure a Neil LaBute movie as you're going to get. I'm not sure about the first two that I mentioned there, but this one was certainly a play and seems to be his most widely performed play. It's still being performed quite a lot. And I think it's more known as a play than a film, but this film adaptation has Paul Rudd in it, who apparently is like an old university friend of Neil LaBute, like maybe they did plays together back in the day and stuff. Rachel Weisz, Gretchen Mol, and then the other actor I wasn't familiar with, but it's sort of a four-piece, and all four actors, similarly to the other two movies that we've watched by him, all four actors are very good in it. Well cast, kind of like Jason Patric. He seems to have a knack for seeing something in people that you might not necessarily think they had in them. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have thought that Gretchen Mol was a bonus to a movie like this previously, but she does very well. I mean, I think everyone in it kind of does what they need to. It's a different type of acting than In the Company of Men and Your Friends and Neighbors, which feel very 90s and very theatre-y. I don't want to use the word theatrical because that evokes like Nicolas Cage and stuff like that, but that kind of theatrical in the sense of like it really feels like they're on stage and you're watching a play. This is more in the vernacular of 2000s rom-com studio picture type thing, and it's kind of interesting watching a film that blends that super generic, almost sugar-coated style and aesthetic with his much darker sensibilities. It's not as misanthropic as the first two that we watched, I think, where almost everyone is complete scumbag. In this one, there's, I mean, you certainly go through a journey over the course of the film of navigating who's good and who's bad, and, or kind of judging people. You sort of start off the movie with only one obvious asshole in the sort of four-piece, and then over the course of the film you see some highly questionable behavior from like the two nicest people in the movie, and then at the end of the movie you see some pretty awful behavior, or it is revealed, I suppose, that there has been awful behavior ongoing from one of the other seemingly fairly nice, although obviously she was a bit prickly and bit hard to pin down, but it does kind of pull the rug out from under you at the end and make you kind of, or reframes the whole rest of the film. I really enjoyed that trick. It's like kind of like In the Company of Men. It's a film with a specific singular idea, almost a gimmick, like a specific hook. In the Company of Men gives you the hook right up front, even though it does have a twist. This film gives you the hook at the end, but they are quite similar in many ways, and quite different in many ways as well. I thought the transformation of Rudd over the course of the movie was pretty good. I remember at the beginning of the film going, wow, he really wasn't movie starish at all in this era. I remember him in Clueless, and I've known him now when he's a superstar. I was thinking this must have been around the time he was in Friends. But yeah, I was like, God, he really just doesn't, he's really rough around the edges. And what I wasn't realizing, of course, is that's all deliberate. I was wondering, did they use prosthetics to make him fat, or did they, I mean, he's not fat, but he's a bit chubby, like, or did they just say, look, we're going to shoot the film over a few weeks, and you need to radically lose weight over those few weeks, because it certainly doesn't look like prosthetics, and it could. I mean, I'm sure he's egging it on with like the way he's holding his chin and stuff like that, but it is quite a transformation that he undergoes over the course of the film. Yeah, again, I feel like we're sort of 3 for 3 here with Neil LaBute in terms of like highly entertaining and interesting cinema. I think in the way that I felt that in The Company of the Men it was the stronger, and then Your Friends and Neighbors was a bit of a drop down. This one, in some ways, is a bit of a drop down, or in some ways it's, I mean, all three movies I put on a fairly equal footing, but if forced, I probably would say that there is a you know, diminishing returns, kind of this gradual decline film by film, but it's minor for me. And we're now with 2003's in The Shape of Things, we're, you know, almost a decade into his career. So, you know, that's pretty decent. I am ignoring the films that he didn't write, or that he didn't originate the idea for, like Nurse Betty, for example. I have seen that back in the day, but I think what I'm trying to do now is work my way through his career, looking exclusively at films where he is the sole writer, and not something like The Wicker Man, where yes, he did write the screenplay, but it's an adaptation. Talking films where he is the sole writer, the whole thing comes from him, and he's the director, and then just kind of, for better or worse, seeing how that evolves. But at this point with this movie, I think it's still really, really compelling viewing. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the next one that can be characterized that way as like pure Neil LaBute writer-director is a film called Some Velvet Morning. So I think I'll check that out, and that comes 10 years after The Shape of Things. So it'd be interesting to see. He'd had done a fair bit of other work in that intervening time, and certainly theatre seems to be his main focus always, but he had done quite a lot of like TV and film and stuff like that. So yeah, what else to say about the movie? I mean, it's a devastating revelation at the end. I loved the exploration of the infidelity in the film between Paul Rudd and Gretchen Mol, because it's probably the most forgivable infidelity I've seen in a movie, or that I can think of. For starters, we know that Gretchen Mol's partner is a complete asshole and has cheated on her multiple times and seems to be abusive in various ways. Now, of course, I'm not saying that excuses people cheating. The appropriate thing is to end the relationship, but you can see how her situation is really bad, and she's in a really tough place. And then, you know, he's largely blameless in it. Well, we don't quite see the extent of where it goes, and there's allusions to it maybe progressing further, but he's obviously been sort of preyed upon by her, put it one way, and I don't know, just kind of like gently evolved. It's interesting to kind of see what is the film examining. Is it that he's changed so much that he's now an attractive mate to people, and she's attracted to this newly sculpted version of him, or that the true him that she's always kind of underappreciated is being revealed to him. I suppose that's one of the kind of discussions that one could have about this film, is what is Rachel Weisz manifesting here? Is it like a true actualization of Paul Rudd, or is it a fictional creation that she's erasing the real him and replacing it with something else? But yeah, plenty going on. Always good dialogue, like always interesting dialogue. Not just the lines, but the whole ideas for what they're up to, what they're talking about. It's interesting. I normally don't like quite sort of fake stylized dialogue in things, and I usually find it quite off-putting. I've struggled, for example, with the guy who made Manchester by the Sea, where I feel like a lot of the time I'm listening to that dialogue and I'm like, it's trying to be realistic, but it's so unrealistic, the exact kind of pattern of how they're talking. But I think there's some people like Woody Allen, for example, and certainly Neil LaBute, who are kind of in a safe space because they're not trying to be realistic, or at least if they are trying to be realistic, then they're completely failing and I'm misreading it. But my interpretation is that it's almost like Wes Anderson, where like we're not trying to be realistic here. Same with Yorgos Lanthimos. We're existing in a stylized bubble of how people talk, and it just, I don't know, seems appropriate. Even like this is a completely different type of content, but Dawson's Creek, I would say, is an example, or Kevin Williamson's films of that era, Scream, and I know he did Last Summer. It's like, okay, this is a way that, what if people did speak to each other like this? Then we're going to just assume that to be correct, and or that's a given. You don't question that. That's just, it is what it is, and that is a appropriate idiom to operate within to discuss all of these themes more aggressively or quickly, and that works really well here. But I can also see it's like a whisker away from me disliking it. For one reason or another, I've really liked these three films, but I think his films are, and this is probably true of all the other people I just mentioned as well, because of that kind of stylized fake aesthetic to the language, if you're not on board or if you're not liking it, these seem like quite hateable films. I mean, certainly hateable on the grounds of like, some people just don't like bad behavior, bad character, like asshole characters and stuff, but uncomfortable just in terms of like the grating. I just don't want to hear them talking like that anymore. I can definitely see people having that approach to it. But anyway, I liked it. Really enjoyed the three films by him. I think maybe part of the reason why this one might have been just a touch below the others to me is just because it was that bit newer, so it just had less of that 90s indie cinema charm, and was a bit more in the wheelhouse of like 2000s cinema, which is just has just I guess got less charm to me. But that's just a minor personal quibble rather than something actually wrong with the film. And maybe, Aaron Eckhart in The Company Men, virtuoso performance. Jason Patrick in Your Friends and Neighbors, virtuoso performance. This maybe is lacking like an absolute sledgehammer brilliant performance, and that's probably another thing that kind of makes a slight drop down in quality. But it also kind of quietly works in not having such a showy performance, because it slips more in with 2000s rom-coms, and it's almost like it's disguised as, if you saw the trailer for this, and I imagine the studio in trying to sell this movie probably hid how sort of dark it is from the ticket buying public. I'd imagine the trailer would look very similar to just some other rom-com from the era, or certainly one could cut trailer that looked identical, because the acting style, the visuals, everything like that is the same. It's also interesting that we've got this kind of theme of a singular musical choice. In the Company of Men, it's that tribal drumming that you hear between the kind of, well, when they get those little interstitial titles or whatever, first week, second week. Then you've got the Metallica music all done by like a chamber quartet or whatever in Your Friends and Neighbors, and then this one it's all Elvis Costello music but instrumental versions. So yeah, anyway, good movie, likes it a lot, and I'll definitely continue checking out his stuff.
Hey man, just after finishing The Shape of Things there, I've got to strongly disagree with one thing in particular, and you weren't flowing with praise, but there was enough praise in there that even any praise at all is enough to be on the wrong side of my opinion with this, because I think Paul Rudd was absolutely diabolically bad in this movie. I think he got the emotional dynamics of a Farley movie, not something like Green Book, but something like Stuck on You or just movies like that. I know Paul Rudd is in Dinner with the Schmucks, but it's when we all know this is ridiculous and then we try and give someone some emotional response to things, but it's clearly they're not on the joke, and they're a fish out of water in their own world. Everything he does in this movie was distractingly cringe to me. His movement, how he's flopping about, how he tries to cry, all these acting tics, all the facial expressions he makes are really bad to me. I thought it was one of the worst performances I'd say I've seen in a long time, and it doesn't gel with the movie at all. And I know in the play it's the four of them originally, like Rachel Weisz, Frank Weller is his name, was it? Paul Rudd and Gretchen Mol. I know they're in the play, and maybe Paul Rudd's pantomime shtick probably go a lot further in the play format, the way he's constantly beckoning to the camera and beckoning with his emotions and signposts and everything he does. I thought it was really bad. It's almost like just in these really, like something like in The Water Boy, where, okay, Adam Sandler is meant to be slow, but we all know he's just acting slow and he's not doing a very good job of it because it's funny. Everything Paul Rudd does in this movie is, oh, he's acting innocent, he's acting shy, but it's like something I would do in drama school. And I'm not sure, maybe it feels more 2000s rom-com because of whatever the hell he's doing in this movie that confuses it and dilutes it very much more, should I say, because everyone else I think is tonally right, and obviously it is a bit more sheen to it than the 90s smoke room aesthetic, as I like to call it just now for the first time ever. There's a bit more sheen to this, and I think everyone else is all right. They don't cross over into a Farley's brother or a Billy Madison. Paul Rudd is a Billy Madison in this. I thought, yeah, I have to strongly disagree with that. So even how he gets on thing in the park. You know, he just sits on the bed. Just how when he's sad, when he's thinking. Everything he's doing in this movie just bugged the hell out of me. Thought Rachel Weisz did well. I like how she is introduced as an almost manic pixie dream girl. Or she's at the sculpture and she starts talking about art. And she's very much presented as a kooky kind of art student that's going to take Paul Rudd out of his shell, and they're both two quirky characters. Although I did have questions that they seem very incompatible for each other. So the movie, mainly because of Paul Rudd, had a very hard sell beginning to me, and I just had to deal with it, and I just had to squirm with it. Now, like you said, I do like the dialogue in this movie, and it is very much, this is how characters talk. And you can tell the kind of stage roots of it, and even in the framing and how they try and move to different parts of the stage, even though it's in a camera. And that is a style that I'm okay with, and it's a style that I'm okay with the dialogue aiding, because it doesn't feel real. It feels like a stylistic choice. Like you said, that Kenneth Lonergan is a good comparison, maybe, of something you can't get past. And I'm not going to pronounce his name, Yorgos, the wickedly talented, that Yorgos guy. His dialogue has a certain musical cadence to it that doesn't actually exist, and someone like Colin Farrell is very good at delivering those lines. And I think, generally speaking, even Paul Rudd, with his mannerisms and his acting, he's capable of delivering that dialogue as well. So that allowed me to settle into this movie eventually. Now, I don't know if it's because we watched the Neil LaBute movies in quick succession, but I guess where this movie was going at about the halfway point, I would say, when she starts talking about her art project and it's a sculpture, then I immediately guessed, and probably in conjunction with the most visual representation of that, when he gets his nose job, I very much thought, oh, he's going to be the art project. And once I guessed that, a lot more things that were happening started to work very well for me, and a lot of the things that I previously thought was maybe too much of that, I don't know what the word is, what I'm looking for here, but that gloss instead of rawness maybe that appears in the packaging of this movie, I started to feel the Neil LaBute nature of this piece, which was quite nice. Now, I remember working it out after the situation with the affair, and like you said, how it's depicted, I wouldn't say it's the most forgivable affair I've seen. Nice sneezing. But yeah, I will say the organic nature of how it happens doesn't make you as mad as certain scenes that are depicted, especially like in the last movie, Friends and Neighbours. It's a very much spontaneous, organic thing where where Gretchen Mol kisses Paul Rudd, and then he just gets caught up in the moment, maybe without even thinking, in an intellectual sense or a consequential sense. So I do agree with that. However, there's an ambiguous nature to what happened after that maybe took away from that initial scene. But I'm with you up until then. So I think this movie really built strongly from the second half of the film, and I don't know if that is because I was aware where this film was going or where the groundwork early on in the movie with the relationship drama and Paul Rudd's character changing and the various interrelationships between the characters had been woven enough for it to start to pay off. Maybe that's the case as well. But I thought it ended really strongly, and once I became aware of where this movie was going, it started raising a lot of things that really caught my attention. It's interesting that the whole project is how much Rachel Weisz's character, who really actually nails her role, I think she does brilliant between someone who's obsessed with her art but maybe is a lot more conflicted than maybe she lets on, and maybe she definitely doesn't regret what she does, but she is driven in pursuit of her art at all costs. I think she's the only one that really nails that, and especially nails it in the finale. But anyway, I think in typical Neil LaVoot fashion, it raises a lot of philosophical discussion and moralistic discussion, and that's what I really like about his movies. And I think it's a bit like the question you've raised, where has Paul Rudd's character began to act that way because of the change? As one of my friends said, you're only as faithful and honest as your options. And we do start to see a change in him. It's very much like in that movie, I think it's Patrick Dempsey, Can't Buy Me Love, where he's a loser and then one girl gives him the seal of approval, and then he becomes the most popular teenager in school. And it is a question of, is it because Rachel Weisz's character gave the seal of approval that this man is desirable, that he's now seen as attractive, or is it because of all the changes she's manipulated him into undertaking? And the other thing that really caught me about this movie was everything she does, every manipulation, the use of sex, the power of suggestion, the gaslighting, maybe, the passive nature of getting somebody to change. I feel like a lot of that happens naturally in unhealthy relationships anyway. So it is very much a study of what happens in an unhealthy, toxic relationship. However, it's got that added thing of, well, if you do that through the prism of art, it just adds another layer to it, doesn't it? We're not just saying that this happens in unhealthy relationships. We're saying that a woman systematically went about doing this and almost imitating something that happens in an unhealthy relationship for art. And it's very much like in Kevin Spacey's plan in Seven. It works. And that's quite damning. Everything she set about to do, she succeeded in. She knew exactly how to make this guy maybe the worst version of himself that he could be. And that says something about society, about people. And yeah, that's where I get to the real core of liking Neil LaVoot. I pronounce his name about the wickedly talented. Yeah, I think I think this is the weakest movie of his, but I still ended up really liking the movie by the end of it and by probably the halfway point. And again, I'm a fan of his dialogue. I'm a fan of how he conducts his movies anyway. So it was quite easy to watch despite my absolute disdain for Paul Rudd in this movie. Yeah, I'm still on board the wagon. In a way, this one is as devastating and as hard-hitting by the end of it as any of the other ones. I think Rachel Weisz really nails that final scene where she's unveiling everything, and just that look in her eyes and how she almost looks demonic, but also really sad. Maybe sad that she succeeded, maybe sad that that's the nature of people, and you can infer a lot from her acting as well. Like, did she get hurt like this before? And she's trying to demonstrate that this will happen over and over again once you try to improve somebody. It's that Aaron Eckhart effect in the company of men. You don't really get to the bottom of it, but you're just dissecting possibilities that may or may not be the case. So yeah, ultimately I really enjoyed it, and I've really enjoyed all these films so far under the careful set of scientific controls we do to make sure that it is actually a Neil LaVoot film. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this one as well. Just a side note as well, Cillian Murphy ended up, I think, playing the Paul Rudd character on stage. Now, it could be the friend character, I don't know. I didn't fully look at this. But yeah, I feel like a different actor other than Paul Rudd would have changed this into something more in line with the work that we've seen up till now. But yeah, that's just my opinion.
Yeah, it'd be great to see Cillian in this. I think it is the Paul Rudd character that he played. I agree with you on the wavelength that Paul Rudd is operating on. He's definitely in that Happy Madison, Farley Brothers, and more, I would say, just generic rom-com, silly rom-com acting style. We just had very different responses to that. So like, yeah, all of his physical acting, the way he kind of shuffles around, and his kind of like beta male posturing and everything like that, it's very over-egged. It's very artificial. I think for me, that clicked me into the 2000s rom-com aesthetic with this film, and also the fact that Gretchen Mol and Rachel Weisz are very conventionally attractive and look, especially Gretchen Mol, they look plucked from a 2000s rom-com. That all kind of worked together with Paul Rudd's performance, and Paul Rudd's performance kind of leads the movie to create a consistent, quite familiar genre experience, but then the Neil LaBute of it all is subverting. So, funnily enough, I agree with you on what Paul Rudd's performance is like, and far from being a struggle for me, it was actually like an asset to the film. And one of the things that makes this film interesting, just for added context, this morning I watched the first half of Some Velvet Morning, which is the next one that we'll get to. And it's interesting seeing how his directing style has evolved and how cinematic his movies are. I mean, certainly he would be one of the least cinematic directors that I've ever kind of latched onto and worked through his career. He's no Chris Nolan, is he? But we've commented with all these films on how he's managed to create something somewhat cinematic when really you're doing something quite similar to just reading a play. It's all dialogue. There basically no physical events happen. It's entirely driven by dialogue. There's no speaking parts for extras or sort of supporting characters or anything. It's just like very much a play. And the films go about it or don't go about it in different ways. But for this one, I can't say for sure this is fully intentional, but what I got is that this film is kind of a deliberate subversion of, or deliberate reference to the mainstream rom-coms of its day. And so, yeah, Paul Rudd worked for me in this movie. Sometimes the stuff that you're highlighting of like bits where he moves around and just all the gurning and everything, and just how far pushed that performance is, sometimes it wasn't working 100%. I think if you look at something like Ant-Man, you can see that Paul Rudd has got a thing that he can do, which is be very charming and likable. He's done it in Clueless, he's done it in like several movies over the years. Some Judd Apatow movies as well. And I think that's his forte, and I think he has very limited talent beyond that. And I think there's things that he does in this film that he doesn't pull off because he's limited in what he can do as an actor. But overall, even though I agree that it's stuck on you territory, it somehow worked for me. And now that you say that the other actors aren't operating on that wavelength and they're more like realistic and more maybe like the previous films we've watched from Neil LaBute, now I can see that. But as I was watching it, maybe because of the way that they looked, maybe because Rudd's energy sort of dominates the film to an extent, it all felt quite cohesive to me. Now, you mentioned that you guessed where the film was going about halfway through. So I didn't guess that he was literally her art project, and that she was literally just in it purely for the like it was all fake. It was a fake relationship, and she didn't have any interest in him, and it was purely an art project. I didn't guess that. Now, I did think from a very early point in the movie that the way that the film was about her like molding him and sculpting him, and that was a deliberate reference to the fact that she is an artist and she's into sculpture, and her obsession in life is the shape of things, the how things take form and how things are crafted. So I was sort of watching that narrative the whole way through. I just didn't realize that she was being completely disingenuous the entire way through. And also, she's a slippery character. Like, the very first time we see her, she's doing a lot of very, very questionable behavior. And so it's not like I ever thought she was like just lovely, completely innocent, completely to be trusted. Like, for example, when she sets up that meeting between Gretchen Mol and herself and Paul Rudd and reveals that she kissed the other guy, Fred Weller or whatever he's called, that there's stuff like that happening all the time where it's unclear whether or not he can trust her. Now, it ultimately turns out to be the case that like she didn't deserve one iota of trust, but the end, exactly what's happening in the film was unclear to me until it's revealed, more or less. But it was somewhat similar to my existing interpretation of the film. One very interesting thing that happens in that ending, when he goes back to the art show and confronts her, and when he starts crying when he says that the ring was his grandmother's, I think you referenced that as something that didn't work for you. I thought that was like by far and away the best piece of acting that Paul Rudd did, when he kind of slightly cries at that moment. I thought that was brilliant, actually. But one thing he asked her, he says, was any of it true? And she says, remember that time where you asked me this or something? I can't actually remember the exchange, but she highlights one thing that was true. And I haven't gone back and rewatched it, so I'm not sure. But do we see that in the movie? Is that a callback to a moment that we've seen? And if so, is do we get to hear what it was that was said that we then later find out was true? Because I don't have that in my head, and whether it's omitted from the film or included in the film, both would be quite an interesting and important decision. So, yeah, not sure if you caught that. You've got a little bit better attention to detail than I do, I think. And then just like on another thing that you mentioned, you said that, correct me if I'm misquoting you here, but I think you said that, like the Kevin Spacey master plan in Seven, her project, if you will, is molding him into being the worst version of himself. That definitely wasn't my takeaway at all. I could be wrong on this, but my interpretation was that her project was showing how much another person can transform purely through suggestion from an exterior party, and that she wasn't trying to make him good or bad. She was just trying to greatly influence what he is and go, look, he was this. I was purely around him and coming up with ideas and, affirming certain things and suggesting other things. And he's now completely different to that other person. He looks completely different. He acts completely different. He does things that the other person wouldn't have done. But I didn't feel at all that she was trying to make him. She was trying to go, look, people can become monsters or something like that. What some of the stuff that he does via this transformation is unlikable, I suppose. We have maybe slightly different opinions in like how bad the infidelity stuff that happens in the film is. I think it is, as you said, we don't know what happened after they left and they went down to the beach or something like that. We get the impression that something more maybe happened, and I'm not trying to say that his hands are clean at all, but I felt compared to in the whatever spectrum exists of infidelity, it seems to be like he wasn't absolute total scumbag piece of shit. Like I didn't get that impression from it. It's a lot to do with the acting, the presentation and stuff. So it's difficult to kind of judge, especially seeing as they're fictional characters. But other than that, he's a good, and he's clearly in love with her, both before and after that event. And that, to me, that little dalliance felt more like unfinished business, something from the past that maybe should have always happened, and the girl Gretchen was like in a really bad place and needed that at that time. And again, I'm not trying to excuse it, but as much as a film can possibly make it ambiguous or grey whether or not something was okay, I think the film succeeds at that. And I think the rest of how, if you look at him by the end of the movie, I would describe him as like a mostly good, decent person. So I don't think that she's attempted to or succeeded in turning him into the worst version of himself. I think what she's done is turn him into a different version of himself, a very, 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 very different version of himself. And that's kind of what she's trying to show is possible. But yeah, like you said, very interesting film. I'm glad you liked it. I liked it a lot. And as you said, we're doing this kind of interesting scientific exploration of his career where we're omitting half of his movies, but we're following a single through line. I wonder what other directors out there invite that kind of an exploration of it. There's always these directors who do one for me, one for you. They do studio films and then they do independent films. That's an obvious candidate. But anyway, got a call coming in, so better wrap it up. But good movie.
Hey man, just getting back to a few things that you said early on there. Test my memory because I listened to it while I was at work. So I'll the first thing is, I absolutely agree that this movie is very much a subversion of the romantic comedy genre. I guess the argument could be made that all the movies we've watched so far of Neil Booth has been a subversion in one way or the other. The point I'm trying to make is I don't think we need, and I don't think it's helpful, and I think it's quite the opposite for me. Obviously, we had different interpretations. I don't think, even if it is a romantic comedy, that Paul Rudd's performance adds anything to it or nails anything to it as a romantic comedy performance as well, especially based on the balance of everyone else's performance and the movie they're in my opinion. I feel like, not to hammer home my Paul Rudd's point, but even in the context of a romantic comedy, this is much more in line with a gross out comedy or a complete farce. Whereas I would love to have seen a subversion of the romantic comedy genre with somebody at the level of rom-com of Seth Rogen or Joseph Gordon-Levitt when they get involved in the genre, or even sometimes Steve Carell. When they were in romantic comedies, they still managed to play it with a level of respect at the level they're at. And then there's stuff like Stuck on You and Dumb and Dumber and things like that, where it's almost like a Saturday Night Live sketch of that character that's really ill-informed and really badly thought out. It almost seems like, oh, let's see what props we have available to build a sketch around in that moment for that show just before we go on Saturday Night Live. It feels like that for me, whereas I think they totally could have subversed exactly what he was doing and being tonally in tune with everyone else at the level of a Joseph Gordon-Levitt or a Seth Rogen, as I said. I've seen movies like that where it's completely a rom-com and it isn't the Adam Sandler level. But anyway, I will say, it's not just a subversion of a romantic comedy. It's actually, and I guess this is a subgenre of the romantic comedy. It's something that happens quite a lot, even in some Seth Rogen movies, and certainly in, I think it's 500 Days of Summer with Joseph Gordon-Levitt as well. This is a subversion of the Manic Pixie Dream Girl, I would have to say. Even how we're presented with Rachel Weisz's character at the beginning of this movie, even how she's dressed, her aesthetic, her kind of charming weirdness. It seems like she's been dreamt up to, and what would traditionally be badly written, her whole existence is to serve the character of Paul Rudd's character. That's what would happen in a traditional rom-com featuring a manic pixie dream girl. And just like the movies we've watched so far, especially In the Company of Men, which is very much like a romantic comedy minus the niceness, this is almost like a deconstruction of the manic pixie dream girl, in the sense that on the surface she starts out like she's there so Paul Rudd's character can find out things about himself, change for the better, go on this journey, and she's an absolute empty vessel that only exists to push this plot point forward and have him go on the hero's journey, have him change for the better, and have him being a soundboard for all his kooky behavior and excusing it and just being there. But in this, she actually is a manic pixie fucking lunatic in the sense that, yes, she is there to offer that service to him and offer that role that would be traditionally held by a manic pixie dream girl, except she's completely has a separate agenda and character reasons as to why she's there and why she's doing all these things that are totally the antithesis of that. She changes him for the worst. She has a horrible vendetta. She is basically using him as an art project, and everything she would normally do that would just be there for no rhyme or reason other than to serve the main character is actually there to serve her character through those normal conventional channels that would be used by a manic pixie dream girl, which is really cool. And another element to Neil LaVoute's writing that I absolutely love. He always finds a different angle to do these things, and something that I've not witnessed in maybe anything before. To get back to your question about that scene where she whispers in his ear, and did we see that scene? I do believe we did see that scene. It's when they were in bed. She whispers something in his ear and he whispers something back. You never hear what they say. Now, I guess, and we've talked about this conversation before in relation to something like Lost or Central Mysteries. If you don't have an answer for the mystery, then don't give us what it was, because it can never live up to it. But I feel like when it's a character drama, we're on completely different territory, because it's something like Lost in Translation as well, where I think it's Scarlett Johansson's character whispers something at the end, and people are meant to infer many different things. What did she whisper, and what did he say? And in this, I don't know if maybe this did come out the same year as Lost in Translation, or maybe the year before, but I'm sure it's been used in rom-coms and things before. And I feel like, is there really a point in giving us that scene? Obviously there is a point, and you speculated the omission of it and the inclusion of it would mean different things, and it's something to get into. But I feel like if we're never going to find out what it is, the writer doesn't know what it is, and it's a moment between the two characters when they just say, oh, that was real, then I feel like that's kind of like having your cake and eat it. You can add a deep moment in that maybe something was real without having to give us the moment of what was real. And I guess it can have us wondering what was real, and I guess it can add to deep conversation or voice note conversation as we're doing now, where we can speculate why was it included, what could possibly have been said, how it relates to the characters. Was it anything big? Was it anything major? But I feel like when the writer doesn't have any other motivation beyond putting that in, then the omission itself, then I'm less interested in it. I guess what is interesting is why he would put it in without an answer, if you want to have that conversation. But I'd have to digest that information a bit more, maybe. And maybe I didn't articulate myself earlier. I didn't think she had a master plan like Kevin Spacey's character in Seven. And this is what I really liked about Rachel Weisz's performance, especially in the end scene. I feel like she knows human nature so well. She knows where this is going to go. She's not manipulating him into being that. she just knows human nature so well that if you have these ingredients, this will happen. And that's horrible about society. The same kind of way in Seven, that he knows anger so well that he knows if this happens, there's no way Brad Pitt's character isn't going to shoot him in the head. I think it's more about knowing human nature. And in her eyes, when she's giving her art gallery exhibition at the end, there's a sadness in her eyes that this is just proof that she was right about human nature, that this happens. It's a sadness that maybe she didn't want it to happen. And I think it's not just about change. It's about when you add certain things in where change goes. Because she did make a wider reference to society that, and I'm paraphrasing here, that this always happens. Now he's seen as interesting. Now he's seen as complicated because he has all these flaws, and just being a nice person that's good isn't sexy enough for society and is just forgotten about. Like, niceness is just a commodity that's not valued in the slightest. So I feel like she is saying something wider about human nature that was proved by this, that she did predict where this was going to go. Obviously she didn't like, it isn't a Frankenstein project. She just knows human nature. It's more of a psychological project where if you use sex, somebody will do this. If you use the power of suggestion and make them more desirable, then obviously there'll be more temptation and this will happen. I feel like those things are there, and I think that's all there in the complicated delivery of Rachel Weisz's face when she's doing this. There's a realization, there's a resignation, there's a disappointment, there's a knowing. There's all these brilliant things going on in her face in that final scene that we don't need dialogue to confirm what she's thinking. Again, like the Aaron Eckhart performance, and maybe a bit better than the Aaron Eckhart performance in the final scene, it conveying so many things that we'll never know the answer to. And that's why I think this movie still has the magic of The Man in 2003 in a much more less heralded movie, and a less easier to watch aesthetically movie for someone like me and you, maybe, because we do like the 90s aesthetic. But yeah, a lot to grapple with there again.
Yeah, all interesting stuff there. As you say, still doing well in 2003, still putting out movies with a lot to talk about, and agreed that the cinematic nature of the film has definitely dropped down. And I can tell you just a little sneak peek ahead to Some Velvet Morning, which I do recommend that you watch. Completely uncinematic, basically televisual at that point, which is a bit of a shame that seems to be in decline across his career. Not quite sure, maybe that's budget shrinking up, or just like the shift to digital and stuff like that. The way filmmaking has just been presented over the years has changed. But yeah, some interesting stuff that you raised there. I do agree that the Paul Rudd performance is more in the vein of those kind of like parody movies or gross out comedies. Like, you could say that the classic rom-com performance is a bit less showy, and is just a bit more straight, I suppose. You know, like thinking of Matthew McConaughey or Tom Hanks or something like that. And this is a little bit more over the top. But for one reason or another, the performance did ground me in that kind of 2000s, very, very mainstream movie. And I think there's also like a gradient from rom-com to Farley Brothers type, you know, Something About Mary or something. They're not a million miles apart, and this movie sits somewhere in between for me. And I think, yeah, the Paul Rudd performance, it could have been a happy accident. I'm not sure if it was by design, but it ended up working quite well for me in that regard. I agree that it uses the manic pixie dream girl trope quite well, certainly reminiscent of Garden State and movies like that. I wonder where this film sits in the evolution of that trope. How many manic pixie dream girls had we had at this point? Because 2003 feels like right kind of at the beginning of that. So it might just be coincidence, but if it is an intentional subversion of that trope, in other words, this magical girl that falls out of the sky to fix you, but then at the end of the movie you find out that she didn't just fall out of the sky, she this is her whole project, and it's a really sinister thing. That's quite interesting. It's the type of film you'd expect to have come out way later in the manic pixie dream girl phenomena. It's funny you mentioned Lost in Translation. That's definitely the film that it evoked for me in that that unheard whisper scene. I disagree that. I mean, it seems to me like you're saying that you can tell from watching this movie that the director or the writer doesn't know what was said, and perhaps by extension you feel that way about Lost in Translation. I don't think that's clear at all. I wouldn't be inclined to make that accusation. I think what I think is that it doesn't matter. It's not essential for us to know, clearly, or otherwise they would have included it. I think the writer may well know. I don't think there's anything in this movie that suggests that they do or don't know. I don't think the fact that they've hidden it from us inherently suggests that they don't have a concrete answer to that. But I think that it is interesting because that line that we don't hear is arguably the most important line of dialogue in the film, and arguably the most important line of dialogue in Lost in Translation. I'd go further. I'd say unquestionably the most important line of dialogue in Lost in Translation, and it's not something that the audience gets to hear. And, you know, I think that's great, personally. I get that it's a crutch in the wrong hands, and I can certainly see it a version of Lost in Translation, or a version of this film where I just don't buy it whatsoever. I don't think that the film has earned that. In this case, and in Lost in Translation, I think it's absolutely earned. It's basically like, in both cases, you've got a little baby in my arm, you might be able to hear that. In both cases, you have a relationship that has reached a point of profundity that almost nothing could sum up more eloquently than allowing the audience to hypothesize about what they think what they think is the essence of the truth of that relationship. Like that to me is a much more interesting and rewarding audience journey for me to go, for me to spend potentially weeks pondering on what really is this Rachel Weisz character? What does she really feel about him? What does she really feel about herself? What does she really think and feel about the world? And to get that, to actually have the writer, you know, sum that up in a single line of dialogue, that's much less expansive for the film. They might write a great line of dialogue that makes you think and, you know, gives you pause to consider the character, but I just don't think that they can really compete with giving that question to the audience. So I'm a big fan of that. Yeah, I think the whole motivation of Rachel Weisz is as you said, it's the most interesting part of the film in a way. I think we have some sort of slight disagreements about like what she's actually doing. I think you're sort of suggesting that her project is to sort of show how people will be corrupted. Correct me if I'm wrong there. I don't necessarily feel that. I think it's purely just she's making an attempt to show that people are incredibly malleable purely through suggestion and positive or negative reinforcement from others, and that one's identity is not a fixed thing. It's something that can be greatly changed by quite gentle external forces, as opposed to making some sort of like misanthropic commentary on the fact that humans are inherently bad or destructive, and they're just, all people are capable of doing bad things. But yeah, either way, the fact that it's the third one in a row that's given us plenty to chew over and talk about is great. And I think that seems to be the through line. I can imagine them as plays. You go see the play, and then on the way home, you stop for a drink and you have a big chat about it. It seems to be conversation starters that he gravitates towards. And that's kind of interesting because not much actually happens in the films. This one has more events actually happen, but compared to your average movie, they are quite just like people in rooms talking, and then just kind of like one event happens along the way sort of thing, or one or two. So the majority of the activity kind of happens in digesting the film after the fact. But yeah, just one last note on Paul Rudd, seeing as we seem to be dwelling on that. Although it worked for me better than it worked for you, I won't necessarily say that it wouldn't have been better had it had a more realistic, less kind of over the top, sort of ridiculous performance. Because obviously, we've watched Your Friends and Neighbours, we've watched In the Company of Men, and we've watched The Shape of Things, and the two performances that stick out as being Farrelly brothers are Ben Stiller and Paul Rudd, and they were the only two performances I had any issues with across the two movies, and they are the two worst performances across the two movies, I'd say. So I am critical of those performances, but where with you it was like, Jesus, I really have to try and work with this. Okay, like just don't let it bother me. Like you're really putting in a lot of effort. For me, there was enough in there that I kind of actually was fine with it. But I do think that this film could stand to be improved with a better performance that's more in line with the other stuff we've seen across these movies. So I just want to like make sure that is captured, because we've split in different directions here on Paul Rudd's performance, but neither of us are like, that was perfect kind of thing.
Just getting back to what you said there. You're certainly correct that it is true that I can't say without any confidence or certainty that the director and writer didn't have anything in mind what was said when those two characters whisper in each other's ear. I just feel like, for me, it was totally inconsequential to the film in large, where something like Lost in Translation, I remember that the whisper at the end seemed to be very much on point with what is going on the whole film, and people being lost and people trying to find a connection and people not fully finding a connection and being bounded and bonding over a very particular place in time and moment in time. And the ear whisper at the end of that movie is very much on theme, in the sense that it's literally called Lost in Translation, and the whisper is something we don't actually get to hear, and it's something that very much adds to the layers of characters we've followed between Scarlett Johansson and Bill Murray in that movie. Whereas in this, I don't really feel like it has much to do with anything, and it's just an add-on thing, and a layer that really didn't really matter to me. And like you said, I like pondering what certain things mean weeks and days after movies. So I'm not against the we didn't hear the dialogue that we're meant to hear approach. I just feel the level that it works usually comes down with the level I feel about it and the level of disappointment I feel and frustration in a positive way of not being able to crack definitively what was said. And in the sense of Lost in Translation, I remember thinking, oh, I really want to know what they say. I wonder what they said. You know? Whereas in this, I was like, well, that doesn't really matter regards to anything, because the whole point was she was using him. It was an art project, and it wasn't really exploring how someone can get close to the subject, not really in any thorough way or definitive way. So I don't think that really mattered. And the other thing was, and I could be wrong because I can't fully remember this, but I remember Paul Rudd, his expression at the time didn't particularly lend itself to anything deep or beyond peripheral to me as well, because he makes this kind of expression. Now, I could be remembering this wrong, and I felt that kind of made me think it was more along the lines of, that thing was true? That you felt that in that moment? And it didn't really matter, like a riddle that I needed cracking or thought about cracking or that I needed to think about for days later. So I think if you want to use that technique of not giving us the important information so we can investigate in the coming weeks, both in discussions and our own mind, I think the strength of it normally comes down to, and the fact that makes me think there's not an answer, how much that overall lack of information ties into the broader picture that's been depicted. And I feel like in this movie, it didn't really matter. It felt like an afterthought. It felt like, that would be an interesting concept. We haven't explored the concept, but that's another thing I can add in there. Now, maybe that mightn't be true, but I feel like in Lost in Translation, it's so on point to everything that it just really adds to it. So the strength of that comes down to what I just articulated, really. And don't worry, it will be written down in the annals of history that you also had problems with Paul Rudd's performance. Funnily enough, I didn't have as much problem with Ben Stiller at the time, and I remember you did, so it's interesting in two different movies how it stood out more. But now that I've watched this movie, I feel like in retrospect I'm also a little bit more down on Ben Stiller's, but maybe just because I thought taken to the extreme degree by Paul Rudd, it almost highlighted Ben Stiller's performance being like swimming against the current of everyone else's performance, if you will. So yeah, and I will be checking out his next movie as well. So at least I'm gonna go as far in his catalogue as that next movie. Did you say something? The Boulevard one, yeah.
I love that you've just logged it in your head as the Boulevard one. Some Velvet Morning is the name of the movie. Watched it this morning, or finished it this morning, and yeah, we'll talk about that shortly. I think whenever we have these sort of disagreements on one, not quite throwaway, but one relatively minor detail in a film, because we just like talking about them at such great length, it makes it feel or seem like there's more of a disagreement. I actually agree with most of what you said there. I think when you said that first voice note about it, I was under the impression that you felt it was a bit of a dud moment in Lost in Translation as well. Whereas you've now clarified that you think it's not that you think that that trope carries no weight, full stop. It's that you think that it's not done particularly well here, or that it doesn't add much to the film. I think Lost in Translation is a better film than this. I think, well, I was going to say that I think that the use of the trope is more poignant in Lost in Translation, as you sort of asserted, or expansive, carries more weight, more interesting. I actually don't really think that. I think that it works just as well in this film for me. But I think that's because, like you've said, that event happening, that like unheard whisper, is very thematically consistent with Lost in Translation, but here it just feels like it's like an add-on, like plucked out of nowhere. It doesn't really resonate with the rest of the film. That's where I disagree. I think it has a place in this film as much as it does in Lost in Translation. Now, Sofia Coppola, obviously a much better director than Neil LaBute. The reaction of Paul Rudd that you referred to, I can't quite remember it, but that sort of says it all. If I can't remember it, then it mustn't have added to the moment much, his reaction. But where we disagree is I think that the idea of being in a relationship with someone, I mean, a relationship that where you're in love with each other, it's about as deep a relationship as you can possibly have with someone. Then finding out that it was all bullshit, that she was just essentially acting and lying the entire time. And then, furthermore, finding out that there was one moment in the midst of all that was genuine, and that is your only kernel for who really was she? What did she really think and feel and all that? That is fascinating to me. And then the decision to not tell us what that is, I think is brilliant, personally. I think that is, it's mysterious. It allows the audience to go, like, it prompts the audience to make the investigation that he's making. Of course, he's got the context of what is said, but if we did have that context, we might kind of just, it might be a bit of a short and quick inquisition that we made, whereas not having that information, it's like almost like teasing us to get into this frantic, like almost futile quest of trying to pin down what was real. And I don't know, I think that's good. As you mentioned, you alluded to Lost earlier. We're both big fans of mystery. I've enjoyed David Lynch movies where he wants to put you in a place of not understanding something, but trying to understand. And I get that it's manipulative. I get that it's sort of cookie cutter because it's been done before. I mean, like you, I'm not quite sure on the timeline between this and Lost in Translation, but we've certainly seen this trope enough times that that one would imagine it existed prior to this film's release. I can't actually think of an example, but it doesn't seem like the most revolutionary piece of screenwriting in the world to put that in. So that's you could argue that's a complaint. It's not a complaint I have, but it at least holds the moment back from being like some sort of brilliant for the ages cinema moment. But I do think it works well. I think it's a nice button on the movie, and I guess now a nice button on our conversation about it, because I think we've exhausted everything that you can say about the film. Yeah, it's interesting to see how the career has evolved, and we can move on now to Some Velvet Morning, because we're having this conversation with me having seen that and you not having seen that, and it's part of the same conversation that we've been having about how the push and pull between the theatre medium and the cinema medium exists within his film and the trajectory that it exists on. Plenty more to discuss going forward.
Your mailbox is full. Please delete new or stored messages which you no longer need so that new messages may be received.